On the next slide, please. Before we start our meeting today, we wanted to take a moment during the season of fall to reflect on what you are grateful for. So take a look at these pictures and we ask you, what are you most grateful for? Or maybe you're grateful for everything. Are you looking forward or grateful for family get-togethers, football season, cooler days ahead, outdoor time? Dodgers, you're grateful that the Dodgers are World Series champions. Maybe you're grateful for anticipating an upcoming getaway or tasty fall harvest. Or if something else is not on this slide, then share it in the chat. So again, reflecting on what are you most grateful for? Great. I see a lot of things people are grateful for. Wonderful. Great. Additionally, we also, following this reflection on what we are grateful for, we also want to give thanks to all the veterans for their bravery in protecting and defending our freedom and way of life as we celebrate next week. Again, we want to have we have gratitude with respect, honor for all the veterans and those that have served or are still serving. I'm Adrienne Balcazar, and I would like to introduce the LCAP State and Federal Programs Unit. Today, joining us from the team is Debbie Cano, Laurel Estrada, Augustine Garcia, Rachel Garcia, Jeannie Keith, Anita Lomeli, and April Grease. And we also have Arthur that's joining us today. To access today's presentation, we ask you to click on the link in the chat. This will take you directly to the slides. But if you use the link at the top of the slide, this will also take you to our presentation. It'll take you straight to our Canvas page, and the presentation can be accessed through the icon as shown here, as well as the agenda and any handouts and resources. Today's topics for today's meeting will begin with the Title I ranking and serving. We'll talk about the use of Title II funds and the use of Title IV funds. We will talk about FPM and what that looks like for Title II and Title IV programs. Then we'll take another look at multi-contracts with federal funds. We'll take a look at required web postings, and we'll end with the LCAP update, specifically the mid-year report and the LCAP instruction update. As usual, please place your questions in the chat box and we will answer any simple questions if we can, and we will follow up with a written response in a Q&A format that will be emailed to each of you. We are recording today's training and we'll post it on our website. And now Augustine will get us started.
Thank you, Adrienne. Good morning and happy Thursday, everyone. We're going to get started this morning with Title I, ranking and serving. So let's first review what ranking and serving is and why it's a critical part of a Title I program. So ranking is a process that districts must use annually to identify high poverty schools that are eligible for Title I services. There are several sources of allowable data to use for this process, but in most cases, free or reduced price meal data is the most accessible and the most commonly used by districts. The numbers are based on students aged 5 through 17 because that's what's used for Title I applications. Serving is the next step. Based on that ranking, districts must determine which schools will receive Title I funding and be served in the coming school year. So we say districts because this typically doesn't apply to charter schools because LEAs with less than 1,000 students or single school districts are not required to rank. So the question you may have is, why do we have to rank schools? So the purpose of ranking is to ensure that Title I funds go to schools with the highest percentage of low-income students, and all the rules push you in that direction. So what numbers are used for ranking? Like I mentioned during the previous slide, most districts use free or reduced price meal numbers taken from CalPADS using that age 5 through 17 count. Because current year CalPADS numbers aren't reported until October each year, prior year's CalPADS numbers, which have been certified, should be used. In the Winter Con app, CDE pre-populates these numbers when you're reporting the results of your ranking. Keep in mind that if you use other numbers for ranking purposes, you'll need to change the pre-populated numbers to the data you're using, and you'll need to maintain documentation. So we recommend not changing the numbers unless there's an extenuating circumstance because one, you'll need to change the pre-populated numbers. Two, changing the numbers can impact the school's eligibility and will disrupt school programs after they've already been started. And three, changes in school eligibility will impact the compliance of the school. So for example, re-ranking with new numbers can mean that a school that was originally identified could fall out of ranking. So you can see all the problems that could arise. Like, would you pull funding mid-year? And how will you account for the money that's already been spent if a school is no longer Title I? How would you account for services that were or weren't provided? And will this put you over the 15% threshold for carryover? What message does it send to the school about planning? So this is why I recommend not changing those numbers. So let's review the rules for ranking and serving, and this is important right here. So schools must be ranked based on poverty percentage using consistent data for all schools. Schools with free and reduced price meal percentages at or above the district average poverty percentage are identified as eligible for funding. Schools with greater than 75% poverty must be served before other eligible schools. And districts may fund any secondary school with at least 50% poverty before serving other eligible schools with the lower poverty percentages. If funding remains after serving these schools, all other eligible schools must be ranked in order of poverty. Schools may be ranked district-wide or by grade span, and districts are not required to fund all eligible schools. Funding for each funded school must be sufficient to support a program of adequate size, scope, and quality to ensure a high likelihood of success in closing achievement gaps. And if any school below 35% poverty is served, then the per low-income student amount for all funded eligible schools must be at least 125% of the LEA allocation for eligible low-income student. So this table here provides an overview of the ranking rules, which I'll be expanding on in the following slides to hopefully give a clearer understanding as we move forward. So let's take a look at how this fictional district ranked and served its 6 schools using the district-wide model. So first, the district collected its poverty data. In this case, it's free or reduced price meal data. The district then ranked its schools in order of poverty from highest to lowest based on the percentage of students eligible for free or reduced price meals. The next step was to identify its eligible schools. So here, if we take a look, there are only 2 schools that are at or above the district's poverty percentage of 50.5%. Those 2 schools, Cortez Middle and Luxor Middle, will be served. Additionally, the district identified 2 more schools, that's Circa Elementary and Flamingo High, that are below the district poverty percentage, but above 35% to also be served. And going back to step 6 on our previous slide, which states that districts are not required to fund all eligible schools, Sahara Elementary, although above 35% and potentially eligible, will not be served. And finally, there's Real Primary. It's both under the district poverty percentage of 50.5% and the 35% threshold, therefore ineligible and will also not be served. Now, the total Title I allocation to this district is $1 million. But before determining the amount available to allocate to schools, the LEA must determine the amount of all required and authorized reservations, such as equitable services, indirect and administrative costs, parent engagement, our homeless youth, our neglected or delinquent youth, and other authorized reservations, and deduct that amount from the $1 million prior to making our school allocations. In this LEA, the allocation to schools is $900,000. With the ranking and serving already determined, This LEA proceeded to calculate its per pupil allocation at $603.62 per student. Knowing that the per pupil allocation for individual school sites can vary, as long as schools with higher low-income percentages receive a higher PPA than schools with a lower PPA, this district determined that Luxor Middle would have a higher PPA due to its higher poverty percentage and its lower academic achievement. So at the bottom of this slide, you'll find a link that'll take you to the non-regulatory guidance for within district allocations under Title I Part A with more scenarios, including ranking by grade span and that 125% scenario that's triggered when you're serving a school under the 35% poverty percentage threshold for your reference. So here we have some reminders about other funding requirements. The first one is that 85% of your whole Title I allocation must be used at Title I schools for direct services to students. Again, direct services are services where the student is the primary recipient of those services. This has been described as including parent engagement and professional development activities related to instruction. LEAs can reserve funds for district-operated activities, but it's important to remember that those funds must also be used for direct services and can only be used at your Title I school sites. Again, the per pupil amount or PPA for school allocations may vary by school, but only if that PPA for the higher poverty schools is higher than the PPA for lower poverty schools. So now let's move on to talk about some exceptions that can be applied to these ranking rules. So the first exception is the grandfather option. If you have an eligible school that was funded in the prior year and is now ineligible, you may fund them for one additional year. You can carry them for an additional year to help them draw down their Title I program. Another exception is if a school is below the district poverty percentage and at or above the 35% percentage. You may serve that school as long as all other schools with higher poverty have been served. And then there's a feeder pattern exception. This is for secondary and middle schools. If you determine that you'll get more accurate poverty data by using data from feeder schools, you may use this method to determine the poverty percentage for your secondary schools. And real quick, let's talk about the confusion between 35 and 40%. So these two numbers are often confused in the context of ranking and serving. 35% applies to the minimum poverty level for serving a school without triggering the exception for schools below the district average and requiring the 125% funding. 40% is the minimum poverty level for a school to implement a school-wide program without a waiver. Anything below that requires a waiver to operate a school-wide program. So when should you rank? We recommend starting the process early. Ranking decisions can begin in the spring after October CalPATH numbers have been certified. Ranking should take place prior to the beginning of the school year so that your schools can be informed of their identification, have a current board-approved SPSA in place, and begin services for students at the beginning of the school year. Even though the ranking is done in the winter release, why should you rank early? Well, because if you identify schools that become ineligible for funding, you can decide not to fund them for the coming year or grandfather them to an additional year. Also to identify newly eligible schools and decide if they will be funded. And to determine if district-wide or grade span ranking will be used. You also want to make sure that school site councils are in place and school plans will be revised and approved prior to the beginning of the school year or when due based on district schedule. There's just so much planning that's needed to implement the Title I program. So here are some questions that you might consider about your current ranking process in light of the intended purposes of Title I. Are you funding all eligible schools? And if so, why? If not, what criteria do you use to determine a cut point? Are you just sprinkling a little money to each school? What's your criteria and how do you determine that? Do you allocate based on the same PPA for all schools? And is this the best use of funds to target your most needy populations? And when determining PPA and number of schools identified, do you take into consideration whether the amount of funds is adequate in order to support a program of sufficient size, scope, and quality? Will this have the likelihood of success in closing achievement gaps? When are you ranking schools and notifying them of estimated funding? How does this impact school planning? How does this impact site carryover? And finally, we have some bottom line questions for you to consider about whose needs are being met by your ranking decisions, students or the adults in the system. Are you ensuring that your highest poverty schools are receiving adequate funding to implement effective programs to really close any achievement gaps? Are you notifying schools in a timely manner to allow them to develop thoughtful, comprehensive plan? If so, then you're likely focusing on student needs. If you're sprinkling funds into as many schools as possible, allowing them to operate a school-wide program regardless of their poverty level or readiness, or if you're notifying late about funding, you're more likely focusing on adult needs. So this concludes my section, and I'll hand it off to Laurel, who'll go over the use of Title II funds.
Thank you, Augustine. Before we get into the uses of funds, let's first review the purpose of Title II. Title II is focused on improving the effectiveness of teachers and school leaders to improve academic achievement. Title II is a district-level program, so no school allocation is required. The main areas are professional development and recruiting and retaining effective teachers, principals, and school leaders. Title II Part A funded activities in your LEA should address the areas of greatest need identified through the needs assessment process that includes prioritization for schools in CSI, ATSI, or TSI. Here are some authorized Title II activities listed in ESSA. The LEA can determine what activities will support goals and strategies based on their needs assessment in order for them to be funded out of Title II Part A. You'll notice that child abuse training is listed, but in California, this is a legal requirement at the state level, and using Title II Part A funds may be supplanting. In addition, CDE has indicated that if LEAs are using Title II funds or plan to use them to support class size reduction, please contact their office for consultation. The activities included in this slide are not eligible under Title II Part A, and the ones with asterisks may never be charged to Title II. CDE has condensed the authorized uses of Title II Part A funds into 4 main areas to include professional learning, recruitment and retention, effective teaching strategies, and understanding and supporting the whole child. This slide includes activities that are examples of ones funded with Title II Part A. Please note once again that using these funds for child abuse training could constitute supplanting since it is required in California. ESSA's definition of the term school leader means a principal, assistant principal, or other individual who is operating an elementary or secondary school and responsible for daily instructional leadership and managerial operations. We will review some recommendations and considerations for selecting impactful activities to be funded with Title II Part A. Linked to the bottom of this slide, we have included specific CDE guidance for use of Title II funds. As decisions are being made as to whether professional development meets the ESSA definition and can be funded through Title II, these points should be considered. Is it sustained, not just one-day workshops, but part of a larger plan? Is it intensive? It should be in-depth and focused on improving teaching and learning. Is it collaborative? Is it integrated in the daily work of educators? Is it data-driven and based on evidence and analysis? Is it focused on improving teaching and learning in the classroom? Evidence-based PD includes practices or programs that have evidence to show that they are effective at producing results and improving outcomes when implemented. The kind of evidence described in ESSA has generally been produced through formal studies and research. This slide delineates the top tiers that are required under ESSA for Title II Part A professional development to be considered evidence-based. Let's look at some examples of professional learning activities. Professional learning activities are based on a needs assessment and meet the federal definition of professional development, which we reviewed in previous slides. This chart includes some examples of professional learning activities that are allowable and not allowable. This is not an exhaustive list, but rather a few examples to help clarify some common questions that the CDE has received about Title II Part A. Please note that there are restrictions for paying teachers, providing PD during a teacher's normal contract hours, along with the use of substitutes. Now let's return to recruitment and retention, which is CDE's second area of allowable use of Title II funds. This chart lists some examples of recruitment activities that are allowable and not allowable. Remember, all of these must first be based on a needs assessment. Title II funded advertising and job fairs would need to be above and beyond what the LEA is otherwise doing. For example, the annual EdJoin subscription is not allowable. This is considered part of what an LEA would do regardless of Title II funding. Please also remember that advertising and job fair expenses charged to Title II must only be for recruiting teachers, principals, and other school leaders. For Title II purposes, other school leaders are those who directly impact instruction. Job titles such as counselors, translators, and activities directors are not considered other school leaders under this definition. LEAs can use Title II to cover travel costs associated with recruiting events, as long as the recruitment is supplemental. Stipends, bonuses, or signing bonuses are all an option. Again, this would only be for teachers, principals, and other school leaders. Other allowable activities include incentives to work in high-needs schools, which may also need to be negotiated with unions, but could be an option. Continuing with retention activities that are allowable under Title II, this chart includes some examples of activities that are allowable and not allowable according to ESSA. These activities are not allowable for private schools or staff members that are non-instructional. Title II cannot be used for cost of living or collective bargaining increases. Title II Part A funds shall be used to supplement and not supplant non-federal funds that would otherwise be used for activities authorized under this title. The LEA may not use Title II funds to pay for activities that, in the absence of these funds, would be provided with state and local funds. The questions in this slide can be used to help determine if costs might be considered supplanting. If the answer to either question is yes, then the use of Title II Part A funds could be supplanting. For example, suppose that state law requires the funds PD to improve teacher knowledge of core academic subjects, which is an allowed use of Title II Part A funds. LEAs would be expected to expend all state funds first, after which they could use funds for additional PD of this sort, which is supplementing. Otherwise, if Title II funds were used while state funds were still available, the CDE would presume that Title II funds were being used to free up the state funds for other uses, which is supplanting. Let's take a look at the framework for making decisions regarding Title II activities. The first step when determining how to use Title II starts with local needs. Title II does not require LEAs to conduct a separate needs assessment. Rather, LEAs should use their data and LCAP process to identify their local needs. Title II is to be used to address these needs. What we have seen in some situations is an LEA will look at the uses of funds for Title II and select an activity based on what they want at that time. The concern with this is that it may not be connected to a larger system-wide strategy, or maybe the professional development does not meet the ESSA definition of PD. Next, consider the highest impact strategy based on evidence and develop a robust implementation plan, which can be incorporated in the LCAP for transparency. Next, provide adequate resources so that implementation is well supported. This is where LEAs can braid or blend their funding. Of course, LEAs should gather information regularly to examine the effectiveness of the strategy to determine next steps. Using this framework will help maximize Title II funds. To conclude this section, please consider these questions as your LEA evaluates selection and/or continuation of activities under Title II Part A. Is this reasonable and necessary? Is this required? How would this be paid for in the absence of Title II Part A funds? Which funding source paid for this previously? Which areas of need were identified in the needs assessments? How can the district maximize sources of funding? Is this the best use of these funds? How is the district coordinating programs? Finally, here are some important reminders. Title II funded activities must be aligned to the needs assessment, must be reasonable, allocable, and necessary, and may not supplant. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Debbie to continue with Title IV.
Thank you, Laurel. Good morning, everyone. Can't believe it's already November. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Title IV use of funds. Next slide, please. So Title IV Part A is part of this, is the student support and academic enrichment. And allocations are calculated using the same formula as Title I Part A. And all LEAs will receive a minimum allocation of $10,000. And once the LCAP federal addendum is approved, the LEA may apply for the Title IV Part A funds. Fiscal reporting is completed through the CONAP, and it's the expectation, just like with the other title monies, that Title IV Part A allocation be obligated and expended during the fiscal year in which it's received. And LEAs have the discretion, if there is carryover, to reallocate, and all remaining funds that are not expended or obligated by September 30th of the succeeding fiscal year will be returned to the CDE. Next slide, please. So the purpose of Title IV Part A is to strengthen student academic achievement by making improvement in 3 categories: access to a well-rounded education, schools, conditions of learning, and then use of technology. Slide. And if an LEA receives an allocation of $30,000 or more, a needs assessment is required. The needs assessment must be completed prior to receiving the LEA allocation and completed at least once every 3 years. And of course, the results of the needs assessment should be considered as you plan how best to use the funds. Also to consider is prioritizing those funds that they're used among the schools with the greatest needs as determined by the LEA, and have the highest percentage of the students that generated the funds that are schools that are identified for comprehensive support and improvement, or are implementing targeted support improvements, so CSI and TSI, and that are identified as persistently dangerous public schools, elementary or secondary. So next slide, please. Title IV is among the funds that nonprofit private schools in your LA boundaries, they must, that you would offer through your equitable services. They, private schools must elect to receive these through your annual consultation. ESSA requires that the expenditures for educational services and other benefits for eligible nonprofit private schools under Title IV-A be equal to the expenditures for the public school programs, taking into account the number and educational needs of the children being served. The amount the LEA must receive for Title IV Part A equitable services to children, their teachers, and other educational personnel in participating nonprofit private schools is based on the total enrollment of nonprofit private school and public school students. Next slide, please. So using the funds. So the use of funds must be meet the following requirements. At least 20% of the funds would be used to support one or more well-rounded activity. At least 20% of funds to support one or more safe and healthy student activity. And then a portion of the funds to support one or more effective use of technology. So those three categories you need to expend the money for those three categories if you are receiving over $30,000. LEAs that are less than 30,000 would need to then give the assurance to meet at least one of the above, one of those requirements, not all three. And Title IV, as with Title II, are the two monies or funds that may be transferred. There are two programs that are permitted to be transferred. And the link on the slide here, the transferability guidance, will detail the information on how the money can be transferred and to which other programs. Okay, next slide, please. Using the funds. So on this and the next slide are ideas of the use of funds in those three categories. So the first is access to a well-rounded education. So this can be used for guidance counseling, college and career counseling, foreign language instruction, so dual language, environmental education, volunteering in community involvement programs. So anything that is providing that well-rounded education for students, STEAM, technology, engineering, math, if you have a STEAM lab, those are the type of activities that would be considered well-rounded educational opportunities. Next slide, please. For safe and healthy students, any PBIS, any of those ideas here on the slide, and for the effective use of technology as well, building the capacity of your infrastructure, purchasing devices and equipment. So next slide, please. For using Title IV can be used on capital expenditures. So some samples of capital expenditures are here on the slide, and then what the activity area that they would be considered. So in order to use the funding for a large purchase, remember, a capital expenditure is property with a useful life of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost that equals or exceeds the federal per unit threshold of $5,000, or a lower threshold if your LEA has set that. And you would have to then make a request and then get that approval before purchase. So next slide, please. So here, if you are, for the purpose of getting that prior approval, this is the samples on the slides here, the form that you would use for the request. And then of course, when you have this equipment, you have to do the same thing as you would with Title I purchases. You would inventory and you would keep that records And then at the time of disposal, you couldn't just get rid of it. You would have to fill out this form for the equipment removal form. And so both of these forms can be found, and information can be found at the link here on making those purchases. Next slide, please. And now deadlines, of course, for Title IV Part A, your deadlines are here. September 30th is the big day. So you need to have the funds expended. So if you just follow the rule, money that you got this year, you spend this year, you don't have to worry about deadlines. But if you don't meet that deadline for carryover and having it spent the following year, then you're going to need to return the money. So we don't want that to happen. Next slide, please. And lastly, as we wrap up Title II and Title IV, we want to ensure that we communicate this last little bit of information. So we know that it's a natural inclination to want to evenly distribute funds to schools or to provide funds in some equal way across your LEA, because that's what feels fair, right? Giving the same amount to everybody because that feels fair. But it's really important to understand the purpose and intent and the use of the funds. Title I and Title IV, Title II and Title IV both require prioritization of schools with the greatest need or with the highest percentage of socioeconomically disadvantaged students. On our slide here, the prioritization guidance for each Title II and Title IV are detailed. Part of the LCAP federal addendum is that you are providing assurances that the funds will be used in compliance with these prioritization requirements. So giving equal amount of money will not produce equitable outcomes. So you have to keep that in mind. The point of the funds is to ensure that those students with the greatest needs will be afforded opportunities they otherwise would not have. Now, thank you. And Adrian's going to discuss FPM for these two programs.
Thank you, Debbie. Hello again. You just heard about the requirements for Title II and Title IV, but what happens when you are not meeting the requirements of each of these programs? Remember, compliance to the assurances and program and requirements is mandatory whether you are selected for an FPM review. The instruments are your guides for a compliant program as well as through an FPM review. Each item will include a description of the law and the evidence requested with the description of what documentation is needed to be provided. So here you have a screenshot of Title II instrument, which is the SEI instrument, and then you have Title IV, which is the SSAE. For the Title II program, the most frequent findings can be seen here in the bar graph. The chart reflects the percentage of findings for the past 3 review cycles. You can see here the top 3 SEI findings from 2021 to 2024 are the use of funds, which also includes the supplement not to plant provision. The second one is the 4-week letter, the parental notification of teacher qualifications. And number 3 is educator equity, identifying and addressing disparities. You may wonder, what exactly is a finding and what would the resolution be? So for the Title II program, here are some common findings from last 23-24 school year of the Los Angeles County districts and charter schools that were reviewed. So as you can see here, for SEI 4, it's looking at identifying and addressing disparities. So the finding for this one district was educator equity data demonstrated disparities of low-income students being taught by a high rate of out-of-field teachers and inexperienced teachers. And so the resolution was that the LEA must submit a description of the process for collecting and analyzing the educator equity data with the inclusion of the actions that the LEA will take to address any disparities, and also how the educational partners were engaged in this process. SEI 6, the use of funds was definitely a common finding. They look at expenditures, invoices, and interviews, and
reveal
revealed expenditures were not allowed in accordance with the Title II program.
laptops.
Oh, I think, there we go. Somebody's unmuted. Thank you. So the resolution is that the LEA must reimburse the Title II program with the general unrestricted funds and submit a journal entry to the CMT so that the CDE reviewers could review and resolve this finding. For SEI 7, the supplement not supplant, the finding was based upon a review of position control reports, duty statements, interviews, and time and effort records. It was determined that the position was not allowable and shouldn't be funded under Title II, Part A. So the resolution was that the LEA must reimburse the Title II program with general unrestricted funds, and again, submit a journal entry to show this transaction took place and to the CMT for CDE review. More common findings in Title II program was SEI 8, and this was for private school participation, consultation, and LEA control of funds. And this is where the funds must be obligated in the fiscal year for which the funds were received by the LEA. So the finding here was a review of the evidence for the private school equitable services indicated that the LEA was carrying over the private school allocations from year to year. And so again, the resolution here was that the LEA had to show proof that they notified the private school that the funds must be obligated during the year received. They had to remove any references on any of their documentation and paperwork addressing carryover. And then also they needed to actually remove the carryover amounts in the private school's budget. In SEI 9, back on the other slide, certification and licensure, the LEA must ensure that all teachers and paraprofessionals meet the state certification and license requirements. And so the finding was that the paraprofessional authorization list was missing information on certain paraprofessionals, and it didn't indicate how they met the qualification requirement. Another finding in this was on the teacher side. The submitted teacher's credential list was not current and up to date. So the resolution was for these was the LEA had to submit to the CMT a complete and current district-wide list of the paraprofessionals and teachers with the required certification and licensure. SEI 11, parents' right to know teacher qualifications. For this finding, schools that receive Title I funds, the LEA must provide notice that the students have been assigned or have been taught for more than 4 or more consecutive weeks by a teacher that does not meet the state certification requirements. So the finding here was the LEA did not submit the evidence that families were notified about their children being taught by a teacher that did not meet those requirements. So and also another finding was that the LEA did not have a process in place to monitor staff credentialing and assignments. So for these common findings, the resolution was that the LEA had to submit a written plan outlining the process on how they monitor teacher credentials and assignments, and they had to upload that to the CMT. Another resolution was that the district had to provide a 4-week letter training for their human resources department and show proof that the district human resources department was trained in this. So again, as you reflect on your Title II program and you look at what are the systems and processes you have in place, and if you were reviewed, would you have findings? And so again, as you sign these assurances, you are declaring that you will follow all of the requirements to implement a compliant program. And so again, looking back, what maybe the areas do you need to go back and look at your own practices, or inform and train others so that they're all following as well. Because again, it's not one person that is implementing the program, nor is it one person that is making sure that there's compliance. It does take everyone. So in Title II, last year, CDE updated their Title II webpage to provide additional resources for LEAs. So if you follow the link on the slide, it will take you to the Title II webpage. I had to, and just a side note, I tried to go into the CDE website and type that in, and it didn't come up. So I had to come back to this actual PowerPoint presentation and click on the link. So again, if you find that you're not finding something on CDE, we offer on our PowerPoint presentations those live links, as well as in our Q&A, we also compile them so you have a one-stop shop for all the links. So again, we want to help you out. So again, if you click on this link, it will take you to the Title II webpage. And under the Guidance and Accountability tab, you will find this page is organized by the instrument item for Title II SEI. It has a lot of great resources for each item, and I highly encourage everyone to take a look and download all the resources. It has samples, it has PowerPoint presentations, it has great information on each of the items that are being requested. Now let's take a look at the compliance for Title IV. Here are the FPM review findings for the 23-24 school year, and this is statewide, and you can see how some items were significantly higher than others. Items like Item 2, allocations and use of funds, and also item number 8, continued consultation. So let's take a closer look at common findings from last 23-24 school year of the districts and charters in the Los Angeles County. For SSAE 1, the needs assessment. So the finding here was the LEA did not provide any evidence of a Title IV needs assessment. So the resolution is that the LEA had to submit a needs assessment to the CMT that included the synthesized LEA data points to expose areas of needs and the description of how the LEA will utilize the Title IV funds to support the identified area of need. For SSAE 2, allocation and use of funds, the findings were the LEA did not provide the requested vendor invoices or detailed receipts or documentation to substantiate how cost benefits benefit the program. And then, or another finding was the LEA was unable to demonstrate that the expenditures were reasonable, necessary, and allocable in accordance with the statutes and regulations. And so the resolution for this finding was that the district had to upload in the CMT vendor invoices, detailed receipts, and documentation to substantiate how these costs benefited the Title IV program. Also, the district had to upload the general ledger showing expenditures to demonstrate how these costs were allowable and supplemental and did not supplant the state and local funds that would otherwise be used for activities authorized under Title IV. In SSAE 4, the equipment and property, the LEA did not provide CDE a prior approved capital expenditure documentation. So therefore, during the FPM review, it could not determine whether they were in compliance for this item or not. So it became a finding. And then the resolution was that the district had to submit evidence in the CMT to include capital expenditure approval documentation, their inventory records to determine that compliance as appropriately approved were tagged and clearly marked. And also, if it was determined that the equipment and property that was referenced above was not allowable, then the district would have to provide general ledgers showing that they reversed the charges from the Title I program or to the program, or out of the program, and freeing up that money using unrestricted funds. In SSAE 6, equitable services. Here, the district did not provide evidence of an initial consultation with all eligible nonprofit private schools within the boundary area. Also, another finding was there was no evidence that equitable services were provided to an eligible school. So in order to resolve these findings, the LEA had to submit evidence that equitable services were provided to the school or a reasonable explanation as to why there were no services provided. Also, LEA's documentation demonstrating the evaluation of the effectiveness of the equitable services, as well as the documentation that the LEA used to determine future equitable services. So again, making sure that they are servicing and providing that support to the private schools. And lastly, the SSAE 8 was one of the top most common findings. And this one is continued consultation. And so you might ask yourself, so what is that? So the LEA did not provide evidence demonstrating that there was intentional continued consultation with educational partners in order to improve the local activities to meet the purpose of Title IV. So the resolution here was the district had to submit evidence of their preparation, minutes and agendas, their drafts, as well as revisions of to the LCAP federal addendum that included mention of the consultation with their educational partners. So again, making sure that all your components are addressed is critical to resolving any findings. And just like the Title II, if you follow the link on this slide, it will take you to the Title IV webpage. And under these tabs, you'll see activities. And if you click on this tab, you'll find great resources. And again, I highly encourage everyone to take a look and download any and all resources that are available that you will find helpful to you. And now I will turn it over to Anita.
Good morning, everyone. Well, we just took a deep look at important components of the 3 federal grants and reviewed some of their important compliance pieces as well. And in this next section, we'll take a look at multi-year contracts and concerns that LEAs may encounter when using federal funds to pay for them. So let's begin with a scenario that might be a familiar one. I know as a principal, it was familiar to me. A software program designed to identify students' math and reading areas of need, provide targeted support for the student, and determine growth offers you a price for a 1-year license. And let's just say that the price for that 1-year license is $5,000 a school year. But if you purchase a 2-year contract, the software company offers you a 10% discount for a total of $9,000 for the 2 years. But the company has a great deal. If you purchase a 4-year contract, they will give you 4 years for the price of 3, and that's a 25% discount. A $5,000 savings. Who wouldn't want to save some money? But as you prepare the purchase request and you need to decide which funds will be used to pay for the contract, think about this. So about this time in the process, you may be wondering if it's allowable to use federal funds to purchase a multi-year contract. It's always a good idea to give this decision some pause, to stop and think before you hit the submit button and pay for the contract with federal funds. And truth be told, this is a question that we've often gotten from LEAs, and we've checked with CDE and the Compensatory Education Compliance Office to make certain that we are providing you with the correct information. And based on that collaborative conversation held between CDE's fiscal and comp ed monitoring offices, it has been determined that using federal program funds to purchase a multi-year contract is not an allowable practice based on program implications. So let's take a look at some of those implications on the next slide. So to begin, the federal program funds have statutory program requirements and regulations that govern the timing, the use of funds, and evaluation of effectiveness. And all of these rules can be found in the second section of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR Part 200. In the Code of Federal Regulations, you will see that first, federal funds usually have a limited period of availability. Next, the funds most often are awarded and appropriated annually to benefit the current year's program, and hence the famous adage of today's money for today's child. And third, programs under ESSA require an annual evaluation of effectiveness. And so thus, federal program funds have statutory program requirements and regulations that essentially restrict the use of these funds for prepaid contracts over multiple years. Now, there's probably two camps of federal funds that you're probably thinking about. You probably don't want to think about ESSER, but we're just going to use it as an example. ESSER, which were federal funds that, although they have closed out completely, they're a good reference point. And you have ESSA funds. Although there are similarities between these two types of funds, there are a few distinctions that are important to note. First, ESSER funds allowed for a broad range of activities and covered multiple years. In addition, due to the reason that these funds came into existence following the coronavirus national emergency, LEAs were allowed to go back to March of 2020 to cover past expenses. And thus, a multi-year contract or a prepaid expenditure could be covered with ESSER funds so long as the contract was inclusive of the period of availability for each of the three ESSER grants, respective of their own individual timeframe. On the other hand, for ESSA federal funds, the rules are different. These funds can only be used for the current fiscal year. And in addition, legal assurances were signed by the LEAs for these funds, which require the annual evaluation of programs to ensure that they are not of low effectiveness. And for schools with Title I programs, an update or revision to the SIPSA might be necessary based on the annual review of the program. So imagine for a quick second that you were locked into a multi-year contract where you prepaid for upcoming years with ESSA federal funds for a program or services that turned out to be ineffective after your annual evaluation. And it would be unjustifiable and non-compliant to have spent money on something that did not meet the current required need. The old adage once again rings true. Today's money for today's child. Now, there are times when a multi-year contract is fiscally responsible and expenditures will need to be prepaid. And in these cases, there's a specific process and procedure that must be followed. The California School Accounting Manual, also known as CSAM, delineates this procedure for us. So Procedure 420 in the CSAM is implemented if a multi-year contract is realized and restricted dollars will be used. In this case, a schedule of prepaid expenditures must be maintained. So here on this table, we see that the actual cost of a multi-year contract for an identified service or program is $3,000. The schedule portions out the first year and the remaining amount in the subsequent years as applicable. So $1,000 in year one, then $1,000 in year two, and $1,000 in year three. Restricted funds may pay for the first year, which is in this example $1,000, but other funds pay for the remainder of the total, the other $2,000. If it is determined after the annual evaluation that in the following year it is appropriate to use the ESSA Categorical Program Fund, then this specific accounting mechanism found in CSAM Procedure 420 must be used to ensure that the correct amounts are charged for the year in which the benefit is received. Keep in mind, however, that for this procedure, an LEA must follow these accounting steps. The schedule is retained for reference at the time of a future year's charge-off to ensure that the correct amounts are being charged to each succeeding year in which the benefit is received, also known during an FPM as evidence. And second, Charging off the portion applicable to the new fiscal year at the beginning of that year requires that a journal entry be made with a debit charged to the appropriate expenditure account and the credit applied to the prepaid expenditures. This entry should be one of the first entries made. And although an LEA's fiscal and accounting department will be the most knowledgeable about CSAM procedures and the specifics of them all, it is important to note that specific accounting procedures must be followed for multi-year contracts and prepaid expenditures. Equally important is to remember that when using federal restricted dollars, the amount charged to the program is in the same year in which students are benefiting. So in addition to the previous example covering a multi-year contract, there are times when you may find that you need to prepay expenditures in the current year for something that you will actualize in the subsequent year. And again, procedure 420 in the CSAM is going to outline those steps for us. An example of this scenario is the payment of a registration fee for a teacher to attend a conference that will be held in the next fiscal or the next school year. And in order to reserve the teacher's spot, payment must be made in May, even though that teacher will not be attending the conference until November of the following school year. In this case, the charge made to a prepaid account in the current fiscal year, and it will be expensed in the following year when the teacher attends the conference. The prepayment should be recorded in an unrestricted resource and then later expended against the categorical program or federal fund at the time the conference is attended by the teacher. And to conclude this section, here are some additional considerations when dealing with contracts and using federal funds to pay for them. Your internal controls. How does the LEA ensure that the contract is fulfilled and services are provided as described in that contract? Is the contract specific with deliverables, and does it provide remedies if services are not provided as described? Procurement procedures. How will your LEA maintain oversight to ensure that contractors perform in accordance with the terms and conditions of their contract or purchase orders? Were correct procurement procedures followed based on the contract amount? And do procurement procedures tend to vary based on the amount of money being spent on that contract? Allowability. There are many types of funds, each with specific allowable uses. Who's double checking that a program, service, or expense being charged to a fund is allowable? Were the procedures, checks, and balances of the LEA followed? And reasonable and necessary. Is the expense reasonable and necessary for the implementation of the grant? And these are key considerations to really think about and share with relevant personnel at your LEA to ensure proper procedures are followed when using federal funds. Thank you very much for your attention. And now Rachel will close out the federal portion of this meeting with required web postings. Rachel?
Thank you, Anita. And good morning, everyone. So as Anita mentioned, in this next section, we just have a few reminders regarding required web postings. So there are a number of plans, policies, and other documents that LEAs are required to post on their website based on state and federal laws. And in some instances, there are items required to be posted on school websites. And so this can be a challenge for LEAs because there's not one central place where you can go to find out everything that's required to be posted on the LEA website. So to support you with these posting requirements, we created a web postings resource document that we periodically review and update. And so on the slide, we've included a few screenshots, but you can access the full document on our Canvas page, and the link is at the bottom of the slide. And so an important thing to keep in mind is that this document highlights several required web postings, but it is by no means inclusive of all state and federal posting requirements. The resource chart includes a brief description of the posting requirement, as well as a link to the specific education code or other reference where you can find additional information. And several of these posting requirements are monitored through the Federal Program Monitoring or FPM process. So for those items, we've also included the applicable FPM instrument item numbers for your reference. And then on the document, we also bolded key language from statute that specifies how the information needs to be posted on the LEA website. So for example, some items just indicate that the item must be publicly posted on the LEA website, whereas other items indicate it must be prominently posted on the homepage. Or some items must be posted in a prominent and conspicuous location on the website and easily accessible to parents, guardians, and pupils. So it's really important to refer to the language in statute when determining where and how to post the specific items on the LEA website. And so in the next few slides, we're going to highlight some of the items from this resource that are required to be posted on the LEA website. So as you may know, LEAs are required to post the approved LCAP on its website. And the language in statute specifies that it must be prominently posted on the homepage of the internet website. And this requirement applies to school districts, charter schools, as well as county offices of education. For school districts, it's the county-approved LCAP that must be posted. Another important thing to note is that all previously approved LCAPs must be posted on the LEA website per statute. So this means that you should have 10 years of approved LCAPs posted on your website. And also remember that school districts must prominently post on their website all LCAPs submitted by charter schools that were authorized by that school district. And the education code that requires the approved LCAP to be posted on the LEA website also requires the posting of the approved LCAP federal addendum. And this also includes any previously approved versions of the addendum. So education code also requires county offices to post all LCAPs submitted by school districts and charter schools. And so here on this slide, we've included the link to our LACO webpage where the plans are posted. Once you arrive at laco.edu, you'll need to click on LCAPs, which is at the top of the webpage. That will take you to the Los Angeles County LCAPs webpage, where you will see 3 buttons indicating the LCAP cycle years. Here you will find the county-approved LCAPs for all school districts in LA County, as well as LCAPs submitted by charter schools in LA County. So in the event that your LEA does not have all approved LCAPs posted from the past 10 years on your webpage, and you're not sure where to find that specific LCAP, you can just go to our LACO webpage to download the plan. As another reminder, there are some reports that are required to be posted on the LEA website for Proposition 28, Arts and Music in Schools, and also for the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant Funds. So for Proposition 28, Arts and Music in Schools funds, LEAs are required to post the board or body approved annual report on the LEA's website. And this report details the types of arts education programs funded, the number of full-time equivalent teachers, classified personnel, and teaching aides, the number of students served, and the number of school sites providing arts education programs with Proposition 28 funds. And so the first Arts and Music in Schools annual report was due to the CDE this past September 30th. And so this is the annual report that must be posted on the LEA website. For the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant funds, LEAs are required to submit an interim expenditure report for fiscal years 2022-23 and 2023-24 to the CDE by December 15th, 2024. And so this completed interim expenditure report must be made publicly available on the LEA's website. There are also a number of items that are required to be posted on the LEA website related to bullying and harassment prevention per Education Code 234.6b. And so this includes the LEA's policy on suicide prevention in grades 7 through 12 and in kindergarten and grades 1 through 6. It also includes a link to the definition of discrimination and harassment based on sex. Also, the Title IX information that's required by Section 221.61. Also, a link to the Title IX information that's included on the CDE website. And then LEAs must also post the written policy on sexual harassment as it pertains to students. Also, the LEA's policy on preventing and responding to hate violence, if one exists. And then also the LEA's anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, anti-intimidation, and anti-bullying policies. And so it's important to note that the statute also specifies that these items must be readily accessible in a prominent location on the LEA's website and in a manner that is easily accessible to parents or guardians and pupils. And so this slide continues with the items that are related to bullying and harassment prevention that are required to be posted. And so this also includes the LEA's anti-cyberbullying procedures. Also a section on social media bullying that includes all of the references indicated related to possible social media bullying forums. A link to statewide resources compiled by the CDE. And then any additional information that the LEA deems important for preventing bullying and harassment. And so you can see there are a number of items that are required under this education code to be posted on the website. And so again, just remember these must be posted in a manner that is readily accessible in a prominent location on the LEA's website and easily accessible. And so as previously mentioned, several of the required web postings are monitored through the FPM process. And so here we've just included two program instrument examples to highlight what an evidence request could entail. And so the first example is from the ELOP fiscal instrument. And so for item 3 in this instrument, one of the evidence requests is the ELOP program plan. And for this item, the FPM reviewer would review the current board-approved ELOP plan and would verify that the plan is updated at least once every 3 years and that the plan is posted on the LEA's website. And so just an important note regarding this is that if your ELOP plan was approved in the 2021-22 school year, then an update is required this year per the every 3-year requirement. The second example is from the Education Equity Instrument. And for item 3 in this instrument, one of the evidence requests includes the web posting of the pupil suicide prevention policy for grades 7 through 12 and K through 6. And per Education Code, these policies must be readily accessible in a prominent location on the LEA's website, and again, in a manner that is easily accessible to parents, guardians, and students. And for this item, an LEA would need to provide a screenshot of the LEA's homepage to landing page and show the click path to the posted policy. And so the FPM reviewer would be looking to see that this item is readily accessible and in a prominent location. And so as indicated in the evidence request screenshot, a drop-down menu would not be considered a prominent location. So again, it's important to refer to the specific law for the items required to be posted to ensure that you're meeting the requirement. And so again, the web postings resource highlights some required web postings, and it is not an exhaustive list. And so that concludes this section. So I will now turn it over to Jeannie for the LCAP update.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. Let's go on to our first slide. Thank you. So the LCAP update this month begins with a focus on the LCAP mid-year report. And for your reference, this slide identifies the mid-year update in the context of the LEA's annual LCAP planning process. And so the idea here is that by harnessing the coordination of program and fiscal input from those closest to the work at the school and district levels, which is part of an LEA's annual LCAP process, an LEA can develop and provide a mid-year report on the status of the 24-25 LCAP. It's important to keep in mind the alignment between information that is shared in the mid-year report with what the LEA is developing for their annual goal analysis to describe their implementation, estimated actual expenditures, and effectiveness for their actions in making progress toward their target outcomes. So let's move on to review the requirement for the LCAP mid-year update and offer some considerations for planning and presenting the report to the governing entity on or before February 28th. Last year, as you know, per Senate Bill 114, the requirement for an LCAP mid-year report was added to the education codes that outline what must occur prior to the governing body of a charter school or the governing board of a school district or county office adopting the local control and accountability plan. Per these statutes, each LEA must present a report to their governing authority on the annual update to the LCAP and the local control funding formula budget overview for parents. This report must be presented at a regularly scheduled meeting of the governing authority and needs to include the following: all available mid-year outcome data related to the metrics identified in the current year's LCAP, and all available mid-year expenditure and implementation data on all actions identified in the current year's LCAP. So let's take a closer look at each of these data elements and where they are in the LCAP. So here you can see in preparing for the mid-year report, the LEAs will need to review all of the metrics and the actions and expenditures included in each of the goals in the approved or adopted 24-25 LCAP. And identified on the slide is the measuring and reporting results section in the LCAP template, where LEAs identified metrics and targets for year 3 outcomes that are included in each of the goals in the 24-25 LCAP, as well as the section below where actions and expenditures have been identified in each of the LCAP goals. LEAs will report on available data related to these components. You may be wondering about a required format for the report and if it becomes part of the LCAP. Well, the statute does not require that the presentation be included in the LCAP submitted for adoption, and it does not require county oversight or approval of the LEA's presentation. Additionally, LEAs have the flexibility to determine their format for their presentation, and there is not a required template for the presentation. We suggest that LEAs maintain documentation of their presentation in the minutes of their public meeting. It's important to note that several of the requirements outlined in statute that address what must occur prior to the governing authority adopting the LCAP, including that the LEA provided an annual update report in accordance with Ed Code Section 52062A6 or 52068A6 are included in the audit guide. What is important to consider in planning the presentation for your LEA is how it will provide information that is meaningful to the governing entity and the educational partners, and how it connects to the LEA's goal analysis and continuous improvement process. For your reference, the audit guide link is included at the bottom of the slide. So here we offer a visual that breaks down the collection of information required for the mid-year report, ensuring that program, accountability, and fiscal personnel gather the outcome, implementation, and expenditure data for the report in a timely and coordinated manner is key to preparing the LEA report so that it reflects all available and meaningful information to date. So staff collecting this information may be those who have oversight responsibility for supporting implementation of specific actions, collecting and tracking specific outcome data, or tracking expenditure data. So this work should connect to the LEA's annual process. Preparation for the presentation is included as a standalone box in the visual because it takes time and collaboration to prepare aligned information that will present the available status of the 24-25 LCAP metrics, implementation of actions, and expenditures to date. So here we offer some considerations in planning for and presenting the available information that will provide an update about progress being made toward metrics in this year's LCAP, as well as an update on what is in place and the related costs for planned actions to date. LEAs might consider organizing staff to access sources of data for all the metrics in each of the LCAP goals. This will include multiple sources of data, such as data from the dashboard being released shortly, data in CalPads, and DataQuest, as well as data from local surveys and locally defined data. Similarly, LEAs may organize staff with oversight responsibility for implementation of specific actions to collect and share what is in place to date. And this may include reporting about actions that are just starting or those that may have not yet begun. For example, principals may have key information about implementation to date for specific actions at school sites. Additionally, for reporting on mid-year expenditures for actions, it will be important to determine a mid-year point in time from which fiscal personnel can provide an update on expenditures to date for all actions in the approved plan. So over the next few slides, we'll offer some considerations for options for sharing information in the mid-year report. This visual offers a format that may be helpful to gather the information about metrics for the mid-year report. This chart includes each goal's metrics, baseline, and target outcomes from the approved or adopted LCAP, and the column for the current difference from baseline for metrics that have available data, as well as a column for status. This format could be part of the presentation, or it could be used as a tool when collecting the information and organizing your data for the presentation. You can see from the sample where data is included that is either in progress, unknown because the data is not yet available, or where the data that included is known at this point in time. Some LEAs may be working with another provider such as DTS, and they may offer template options that you might want to consider to support your mid-year data collection as well as your presentation. Along with the mid-year update on the implementation for all actions in the LCAP, LEAs are also providing mid-year expenditure data. This information reported will be year-to-date implementation data about what has occurred and the spending information for all the actions included in the 24-25 LCAP. So LEAs will need to determine the mid-year date they use for collection of implementation and expenditure data to share in their presentation. Statute only defines February 28th as the deadline for the presentation. So when reporting mid-year expenditures, LEAs might consider aligning to first interim budget reporting, which would have been calculated by your fiscal services in November and reported to the board in December. Keeping in mind that second interim will report expenditures through January 31st, fiscal staff might not have enough time to complete calculations prior to the February 28th board presentation deadline. So here the key takeaway is that for whatever mid-year date the LEA selects for their reporting date, it will be important and key for program and fiscal staff to connect so that the data about mid-year expenditure and implementation data is consistent. This organizer offered here reports on action and expenditure data for a goal in the plan. It includes a display of all the actions for each LCAP goal, and it's organized by the status of mid-year implementation. Below the status row, LEAs could provide a description about the actions included for each level of implementation. Included here are 3 levels of status to reflect the degree of implementation. These include actions that are in progress, actions that have not started, and completed actions. Following the actions included in the first column for actions that are in progress, the LEA would provide a description about what is in progress. For the status of not started, the LEA might provide a description about what has not started and indicate the related local context. The LEA would determine the descriptions that would provide the local context about their level of implementation for all the actions in the goal, and the LEA would provide a fiscal update for the actions in each of the goals in this year's LCAP. An additional table format offers expenditure and action implementation information for each goal included in this year's LCAP. You'll notice the budgeted information section notes the inclusion of the budget adopted with the adopted LCAP. Then the golden box section identifies the first interim budget as the point in time for reporting expenditures to date. And the last column in the gold box is where the LEA would include a description about their implementation to date. Whatever format the LEA develops for their presentation, the critical component is that the information provided is accessible and includes meaningful detail so that educational partners and the board understand what and where services are in place and the expenditures to date for those services. Lastly, a mid-year report timeline is provided to assist your LEA with the requirement for collection and presentation for the presentation and the actual presentation of the mid-year report. We'll shift our focus now to provide an update on the pending revisions to the LCAP template and instructions. And so this morning, our LCAP update finishes with the pending revisions to the LCAP instructions that address the requirements for the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant funding. Included for your reference on the slide is item 4 in the upcoming State Board of Education meeting. This action item provides CDE's response to the State Board of Education's direction to make revisions to the LCAP instructions for the LCAP template that specify that all unexpended Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant funds be included in the LCAP template for the 25-26, 26-27, and 27-28 LCAP years. So this requirement will be in effect for years 2 and 3 of the 24-25 through 26-27 LCAP cycle, and year 1 of the 27-28 LCAP cycle. In attachment 3, you can follow track changes that indicate the full detail of the revisions being proposed to the specific sections in the LCAP template. I'll provide an overview of the revisions and refer you to review the items in track changes for the full detail. Among the revisions are in the plans summary section for general information are revised instructions that include an option for LEAs to provide information about their strategic plan and vision. Next, the instructions in the reflections section for annual performance include a revision to require LEAs to identify whether or not the LEA has unexpended LREBG funds for the 25-26, 26-27, and 27 LCAP years. Additionally, for LEAs with unexpended funds, the revised instructions require the LEA to identify actions that are fully or partially funded with these funds, explained how actions address the allowable use of these funds, and explains how the action is expected to address areas of needs of students and schools identified in the needs assessment. The goals and actions section have added instructions for required metrics and required actions. The revision requires at least one metric to monitor the impact of each action funded with LREBG funds that are included in the goal. These metrics may be new metrics or metrics already being used to measure progress in the goals and actions in the plan. Also added to this section are required actions for LEAs with unexpended LREBG funds. These instructions address the requirement to conduct a needs assessment and indicate that this needs assessment may be part of the LEA's needs assessment for the LCAP if it meets the legislated requirements. The instructions also require the identification of the action as an LREBG action, an explanation of how research supports the action, and the metric to monitor the impact of the action and the amount of LREBG funds. So, as you can see, there's a lot of detail included in the revisions. And by going to the track changes, you can review the full revision. Our final slide provides reminders of some upcoming deadlines. And these include for Title III English Learner Program Annual Online Report, as well as the Immigrant Student Program Online Report, which are due November 11th. Additionally, the final expenditure report for the in-person instruction grants is due December 1st, and interim expenditure reports for the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant funding is due December 15th, and as you know, must be publicly available on the LEA website. And finally, December dates for Fall 1 CalPAD submission and amendment window are included for your reference. And with that, brings us to our link for feedback on our presentation. We do review the feedback and use the information you share to improve our presentations. And we truly appreciate all the feedback that you can provide. So we ask you to take time to respond to the feedback link. And our final slide includes a reminder of the date for our next meeting, which is Thursday, December 12th. So on behalf of the team, I thank you for joining us today and